When
No,
you
she's in
asked me what they
preservation.
were, I said, I don't know.
and call this meeting to order. First on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from June 11th, 2024. Everyone's had a chance to look at the minutes. We have a motion to approve.
I move.
Second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right. So that moves us on to public comments. Some comments from the public? I guess not. All right. In that case, we'll move on to the board briefing and business. I'll turn it over to staff.
All right, so first up this evening is an update on the underrepresented community grant findings. So we're going to have Urbanist Media joining us via live stream. Lamar has it set up. This is the grant that we received in 2023, the end of 2023, by the National Park Service to evaluate both women and African Americans within the existing National Register nominations to see what had been missed, and then to see if we found anything for new nominations as well. Lamar, can you get the live stream up and running, and we can let Urbanist Media in so they can give their presentation?
Yes, give me just.
Do you need to be at my computer, or can you do that at yours?
I'm going to need to do it from yours.
Okay.
The live stream should be up. They should be coming in. Let me take a look on this and see
Okay.
if I can find something.
I hear a voice somewhere, so we might have something if you can get the screen up and running.
Yes, hello. Sorry, I just didn't know if I should say anything or not.
Hey, Becca, we're going to get the screen up and running. Give
Hey
us a
there.
second.
Hi, thank you, perfect.
Okay, so we've got you up now.
And can she run her PowerPoint? How does that work?
What you'll do,
Is
Deca, when you...
anyone in the room right now?
Yes.
Other than you and Caroline?
We have the full
yeah.
commission here. It is a commission meeting. It is also being live streamed on the city's platform as well.
Hey there. So there should be at the bottom, can you share your screen, Deca, when you have your PowerPoint up?
Yes, give me 1 second.
It'd be nice to have those lights off in the ceiling.
I'm new to this particular software, sorry. And let's see if I can share this screen. So then I'll present.
Yes, please.
Just have full view. And then it's you see the full screen?
We can. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
All right, Decca, you and Vanessa are on.
Okay, so you want us to go ahead and start now. I thought we were going to go at the end, so I'm happy to start. So, going first in this meeting. Is that correct? Yeah, you're
Yes.
not having us at the end of the agenda. You're having us at
No.
the beginning now. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the confirmation. Okay. So we'll introduce ourselves, I believe, real quickly, and then I'll jump into it. So I am Dana Hussein Wetzel. I am a historic preservationist, Secretary of Year qualified, but also currently going to get my PhD in historic preservation at Columbia University. And I am with Urbanist Media, which is a nonprofit that is centered around preserving places through story. We, myself, Decca, and Vanessa, who will introduce herself in a second, are going to present for you. We, along with our team, other historic preservationists, have produced this historic context statement that we presented a historic context statement for African American women, for African Americans and women's history in Decatur, Alabama. But we also did develop some podcast episodes, although that is not going to be much of the focus of presentation.
Decca, can you slow down when you speak because it's coming across as so fast that it's clipping and garbled on our end?
Don't worry.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was passing the baton to Vanessa to introduce herself.
Okay, hi everybody. I will endeavor to speak slowly, but as a New Yorker, that's very difficult for me, so apologies in advance. My name is Vanessa Quirk. I'm with Urbanist Media as well. My background is in journalism. I was integral in the creation of the podcast episodes for this project, but today I'll be speaking to the women's history portion of the historic context statement.
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. So, to kind of dive into this,
So we can see.
let's see what we got here. The next
Thank you.
slide here is a disclaimer. If you guys are not seeing that, please let me know. But just wanted to kind of say this out loud for everybody. This material was produced with assistance from the Historic Preservation Fund administered by the National Park Service, Department of the Interior, under grant number P23AP00274-00. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of the Interior.
I don't see the disclaimer on my screen, so I just wanted to check that others are seeing it.
No, the slide has not moved.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks for letting me know. Let me fix that and let me bear this in again. Now, the screen you're seeing is, are you seeing the, let me present, go back to presentation mode? Okay, so now you're seeing the disclaimer, would that be
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Correct.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so disclaimer, as I just mentioned. Since I've said it out loud, I think we can move to the next screen, which is acknowledgements, and we just felt that it was important to extend our gratitude to the residents of the city of Decatur for inviting us into their city and trusting us to compile this historic context statement on African American women's history. A very special shout out, thank you to Peggy Allentown, Francis Tate, Pastor Dalen Woodall, Reverend Ragland, Barbara Kelly, Bill Wirely, John Allison, and of course Caroline Swope, who you all know. And to kind of provide you some context, and also as historic preservationists, we were under the duty to perform our work under a period of significance, and for this context, we have had that start at 1816 and then end at 1975. This regards the 50-year rule as well for historic properties. The methodology that we used was really utilizing an advisory board, which really helped us make sure that the context of the podcasts reflected the ideas, the stories, and the truths of the local Decatur residents that we spoke with and interviewed. And this context does quite draw upon their research, but it also includes quite a bit of original research regarding not just oral history, but archival materials as we've dug through Morgan County archives and newspaper records and maps and other types of primary sources that have played an integral role in shaping this context. Okay, so this map shows the site. It's just kind of general site area, and I apologize for the erroneous wording there, but I really wanted to focus on at least the two communities that we were able to make sure that we could include a more robust context on. And there's also mention of another community, so called Oklahoma, but really Old Town and Cedar Lake came up quite a bit in our research and both warranted quite a bit of diving into. And with that, going to go into the context regarding the African American history. And like we said, Vanessa will talk about women's history, and then we'll end with some recommendations that will kind of provide you some just some nice conclusions as to what can be done in next potential steps regarding preservation. So here are some historical maps that we have been able to identify, but to talk a little bit about these communities, and also please keep in mind that we have a lot of themes that I'll address some of them. Some things we'll go into in more detail, but because of time, we're really going to be highlighting a few of the things that I think are most relevant, and then also the historic context statement really does speak to everything in a very full way. We've also talked a lot about people, in addition to speaking quite a bit about places. So that preface there kind of allows me to start to talk a little bit about Old Town. Being one of the earliest African American establishments, Indicator was actually Lemons Hotel, which is operated by Burrell Lemons in 1886, and I thought that was just, hearing a little bit about these businesses that existed in Old Town originally, I think might provide a little bit more context on the place. In 1901, the firm Oliver and Stirs Dry Goods Merchants was on Bank Street. It dissolved, and W.E. Stirs, William Stirs, who was the proprietor of Magnolia Drugstore, took it over. And then also the business was located on Bank Street, as was J.J. Sykes Coal and Wood, and some of these are not necessarily extant buildings today, but I think it's important to understand we're really going back to such early history that there's a bit of a context that needs to be understood, that African American businesses and livelihood was existent at some point Indicator history in that area, even before the extant buildings that we will kind of more talk about. But we really did review a lot of historical maps, including 1894 Sanborn maps, also 1908, 1927, 1940, and I think that really helps understand the kind of geospatial context that we were working within, and it revealed changes in the Old Town environment that was consistent with the accounts that former residents have shared. Their neighborhood used to be much denser than it is today, and that's just, I think, important to recognize. And also, your viewers remember that many of Old Town's African American businesses were thriving, particularly during the childhood and a little bit earlier, but the 1900s and really the 1950s and 60s, a lot of residents still are able to speak to those dates back in history. They were called Vine Street Northwest, especially, as the commercial district, and remember places like Miss Susie Green's Frog Cafe, Joseph Brown's grocery store, barbershops, and in the context, we dive more into that and have looked at city directories as well to help fill in gaps. The other community to talk more about here is the Cedar Lake community, which started in the late 1800s by a white woman actually named Lillian Ray Nelson. She built this community into something that actually wasn't necessarily her land originally, and I'll talk more about one of the early African American settlers of the land. But Lillian Ray did build it as an exclusive African American community with the idea that, and it might be more unethical today, but like that keeping African American actually is quite unethical today, and it is. And there is some kind of complex history around Ms. Nelson that we do talk about in the women's context. But the idea was that having this tight African American community in this space would allow them to thrive, which isn't necessarily untrue, but the complex nature of it being the late 1800s, still Jim Crow segregation made that complex. But originally the land was owned, a lot of the land, particularly in Cedar Lake, was owned by a gentleman named Jake Johnson, who was born in 1855 and actually was born enslaved and became a free African American after the Civil War. And so there's this property, a lot of this property that you see on this map here in Cedar Lake, there's notations in the plat map there that also not only noted that Jake Johnson had owned land there, but he also was signatory in kind of how they plat Cedar Lake. So I think we think that his initiative was really important and to warrant mention. We talked about it, look at the context, and the last African American community that we did identify that actually has very, very little historical record around it is Oklahoma, and unfortunately there were not a lot of people to be able to speak to the history of Oklahoma, as in like was the first person or second person to get really the context. But the community was like very much in, especially from John Allison, who was able to give us more insight on this. Thank you, John Allison. Oklahoma was more unplanned community next to the railroad, so being adjacent to the railroads, having those working type homes that you see here on the right-hand side of this Sanborn map from about 1927. All right, so apologize if it seems like I'm going to speak through some slides, but some slides do speak for themselves. We have some key themes that we're going to be talking about a little bit, and not all of these themes are able to be included in the next slides, but we do talk about these as important to the context within Civil War Reconstruction, but really city government, medicine, and health, and religion are some really important ones to know. And then you can really also see with the table migration patterns, but keep in mind this is a population table by race in Morgan County, and it's between 1816 and 1910. And we talked about this again more in the context, but with the formation of New Decatur and Albany, these numbers kind of change based off of, in terms of breaking down how many people actually lived in Decatur versus New Decatur. You'll see in one of the following slides that we were able to actually narrow down more of Decatur as opposed to New Decatur. But for this particular earlier context, we did want to not exclude necessarily one, and it was really complex to include all of it in one table. So for this purpose, we really thought that having the population of Morgan County kind of helped give the argument to what we were laying down. And so just like a couple people that I feel like need to be mentioned again, Burrell Lemons, I mentioned earlier, but he also, so he was born in 1835 in Virginia and eventually did come to Decatur, but he not only was a businessman, but he was in government and he was the city's, one of the city's black policemen. So he was a big deal, and it's actually important to note again, he doesn't have an extant property, but and neither does the Stirs, unfortunately, but they're very, very important to the history of Decatur. And the Stirs actually do have a connection to the First Missionary Baptist Church, which is a church we do talk about. So their connection there does live on, and so with the Stirs, if you're not familiar with their history, Dr. Stirs was the first African-American doctor. They started Magnolia Cemetery and, they started Magnolia Pharmacy, Magnolia Drugstore here, the photograph, which is from the African-American Museum and Library in Oakland. And Eva Stirs is also extremely important, and I think this speaks to the context of women also being as notable as the men. She became the owner and editor of the Guardian Sheet in 1910, and that was a very important piece of material for us actually in our work, because it is an archival source. So with religion and spirituality, we did a lot of work around the podcast with First Missionary Baptist Church, and the Old Town community really, I mean, not just this church, but there's other churches, Newcomb Church, and even other churches that are not necessarily within the period of significance, but do more convention, like King's Methodist. So I think that just to say that there is quite a lot of history around religion and spirituality that a lot of people spoke to, that we don't have time to really dive into it too much here, but there are extant buildings that we know, including those two churches that I mentioned. The other themes related to the Guardians I mentioned, the Scottsboro Boys, which we don't have time to talk about, but it's extremely important. And Peggy is definitely one of the main sources for that. And actually, Dr. Ragland, just to go back and note him as a very important source for African American churches. So both of them are very helpful for us to kind of help piece together a lot of the kind of complicated layers of African American history. But here, I'm going to focus the last couple slides on recreation, because I thought that was kind of an interesting point. But we also have here, just to show you a map, a table that shows you the Decatur city, the way that the migration patterns do start to change is kind of interesting. So now, I apologize. Somebody. I'm just going to keep going because I'm almost done with my section here. One home that we were able to identify was C.W. Bridges' home that was not previously identified. I think that is just extremely, we're extremely lucky to be able to have what remnants we have, and this being his home allowed for us to really dive deeper into his story, which is that he wasn't necessarily born in Decatur, but once he relocated to Decatur in 1923, he became the first African American extension agent in Morgan and Lawrence counties. And he had a career that spanned 40 years, and this led to a lot of other recreational work that he did, including that he was a lifeguard at Paradise Swimming Pool, which was created swimming pool that opened in 1954. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it to Vanessa. I apologize if I went over a little bit of time there. There's so much history and information.
Yeah, just so I'm aware, how much time do we have left so that I can tailor how much information I share?
What she needs.
Look at the time we've got. Easily 10 to 15 minutes, and then you'd have time for questions, because I'm sure there'll be questions, particularly about the African American history.
Okay, all right. In that case, I think I should be able to get to most of it. So, Deborah, would you mind going to the next slide, please? Great. So I'm going to speak to the women's history. What really stood out, the following themes really stood out to me as we were researching this history of Decatur, and I thought it was in particular quite unusual the amount of businesswomen or entrepreneurs that Decatur has in its history, going all the way back to, for example, the 1870s, where thanks to Phil Lowry, who introduced us to Lavinia Dancy Polk, who, upon the death of her husband, Thomas Polk, established the hotel that you see there, the Dancy Polk Hotel. It was originally built in 1829. It's the oldest extant structure in Decatur, and the hotel ended up hosting a lot of important dignitaries, including General Joe Wheeler. And that's an awfully early example of a woman taking on a kind of more entrepreneurial role at a time when it was very unusual to do so. So she's just one early example And in the context, we go into a few more. So, yeah, Deb, you can go to the next slide as I explore some of these other women. Yes, so Lelia Seton Wilder Edmondson, you all may be familiar with her thanks to the scholarship of John Allison, who has done a tremendous amount unearthing information on her. Best known as the first woman to run for Congress in Alabama. But beyond her political life, she accomplished a lot in Decatur in the worlds of politics, but also agriculture and business. Something that stood out to me as we were researching her was that she brought kind of cutting-edge agricultural techniques to Decatur, and as well as fair labor practices that were very unusual for the time period and had tremendous impact, not only Decatur, but throughout the region and even the country. At a certain point, she was so successful with her cotton business that she earned the moniker the Cotton Queen of Alabama, and she represented Alabama at the Cotton States Exposition of 1895 and the Paris Exhibition of 1900. And I think something else that is important to note in her legacy for the region is that in the 1930s and 40s, as she was beginning to kind of wind down her business endeavors, she ended up selling a lot of her land to the Tennessee Valley Authority, and that really allowed for a lot of decades of development in the region. So she's had a tremendous mark on Decatur and Alabama. And we have here a photo of the Old State Bank because Lelia grew up there as a child, and so she has a connection to that very important building in Decatur. Yeah, thank you. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about another businesswoman slash architect, Carolyn Corker Smith. If you listen to the podcast episode on her, you may already know a bit about her background. And I'm very indebted to Barbara Kelly, who was very generous with her time and research about Carolyn Corker Smith. But one thing I do want to emphasize is that it wasn't just unusual that Carolyn Corker Smith was an architect in the 1920s at a time when women could not go to school really to be architects. I mean, Carolyn tried, she applied to many, was not admitted. But not only that, she was a businesswoman who owned multiple lumber mills. And I spoke to an architectural historian for the research of the podcast, and she emphasized to me that that was extremely rare for the time period. There were a handful of women architects, but very, very few that were also business owners. And Carolyn prided herself in her business savvy, and she had a crew of skilled laborers working under her. And they weren't just designing new buildings, but also renovating older buildings and using their expertise in stonework and antiques to help renovate structures. I'm hearing an echo. Can folks still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I did also want to note that one of Carolyn's more important projects was renovating the Old State Bank, as well as designing and building the structures in Delano Park. Though both of those projects were under the auspices of the CWA, or the Civic Works Administration, which was an initiative under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, kind of a precursor to the WPA. And I think, obviously Old State Bank is very important indicator. The Delano Park structures, we came to understand, really hold an important place in the kind of civic life indicator as well. So her influence is very, very important in the city. And she ended up designing about over 700 homes across the country as well. So very prolific, very unusual. someone that Decatur really can be proud that she kind of put so much of her time and effort into their city. Next slide, please. Great. So this is an earlier figure, but I did want to just mention her because another thing that stood out to us in the research around Decatur's women's history is the unique role the city played, especially New Decatur, played in women's suffrage. In general, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, Alabama was not as advanced in terms of suffrage. And New Decatur was really an exception, and we really have to thank Ellen Stevens Hildreth for that. And John Allison has done a lot of research on her as well. But just a few things of note about Ellen. She started the first civic organization devoted to suffrage in Alabama. That was in 1892. The name of that was the Women's Suffrage Club. And she also worked at the New Decatur Advertiser, where she penned the Women's World column on women and women's rights. And so that kind of generated conversation in the region around women's suffrage and women's rights. So I did want to just briefly nod to her as well. Decca, do you want to take this part?
Yeah, so you all have some idea of some of the recommendations that we have identified for African American history. Additional survey inventory work and historic preservation is always really good and important to have, but really it's about also kind of conducting an intensive level survey, because there's a need to be able to formally evaluate both historical significance and integrity. That especially derive from some of the properties that we've identified, especially with, this, like, for example, identifying, making sure all of the buildings that are in Old Town and Cedar Lake, and in particular in Cedar Lake, where there are some buildings that exist, for example, some churches that, might not necessarily possess a lot of historical significance because of its integrity, but I do think that warrants us thinking a little bit differently about historic preservation in a way that also recognizes that, and historic preservation does recognize that changes over time can be significant if they are within the 50-year rule, but that is just, survey inventory is a really important part of kind of the next step, I think, to the work, as well as National Register Historic Places updates, updating the East and West Old Town nominations to include religious significance, because those churches that I mentioned are, there are a number of churches that are in that historic district that currently these historic districts are more suited to their architectural history. So thinking about it and a bit differently from there, and kind of in concert, this is a little bit also about women's history, but the Albany residential district as well would be important to consider updating. As well as important support for physical preservation. A lot of the people we spoke to, churches in particular, noted that they aren't really sure how to secure certain types of funding. And I know actually Carolina's worked with some people, so I just urge, and say, I love that, and please just, hopefully we continue pursuing those types of paths to support the physical preservation of some of these buildings and currently identified as historic preservation districts in our HB district. Further, more additional studies related to oral history interviews, and I say that because there are a number of people that hold a lot of knowledge around the history that might date back to a particular time, and people people don't live forever, but, let's capture their stories if we have an opportunity to. And if that is possible, I think with what we've been able to do with our podcast work and has kind of also worked out with having an advisory board, we were able to really utilize that as a method and as an archive. And furthermore, we did find it quite difficult to identify urban renewal documents and code compliance documents within the city pertaining to the mid-20th century in particular. So I would just encourage, we kind of put in our recommendations that if there is an opportunity to locate those missing archives, that would be very useful in helping really further understand the levels of physical changes in the residential building.
I guess I'll speak briefly to this. Some of the recommendations in the report include a survey to identify buildings significant to women's history indicator, ongoing just recognition of women's history would warrant updating any existing NRHP nominations, including for the New York State Bank, and also for 623 Grant Street, which is the residential building that Carolyn built as a very, very young woman for her mother.
So I think we will absolutely field questions, and I also wanted to point you towards these episodes that really include the voices of the community members and the folks who spoke to us about and been doing the historical research for some of these places that we talk about. So as all the acknowledgements that I kind of mentioned in the beginning, those are really a lot of the both relate to the context and the podcast. So I know you probably have a lot of questions. So feel free to let me know.
Any questions from the commission?
Well, other than the two podcasts, is there any else that's going to be produced by them for the city here, or is?
They have the final report, the context statement with the files. But the podcasts were the primary podcasts along with the context statement.
And how will that be presented to us? Is it just a paper report they're going to be
It's a
sending?
digital report that is sent to the Park Service.
Okay.
And then we have a copy of it as well.
Okay. Will it be published out on?
It'll be
Yeah,
on
the website, or-
it'll be on the city's page, yeah.
Okay, where people can access it. Okay.
John, you started to open your mouth like you had something. I wasn't sure if you
No, I
had.
don't think so. You guys have some questions?
Only question, is there a place where we can access what they just went over with their presentation now?
It's a shortened version of the findings that'll be in the final report.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and the podcast, those are on the city's HPC
Sure.
page, so you can get both of those
Yeah,
from there.
I knew about the podcast, but I didn't know about this. So this is a condensed version of what we're going to get, the final report.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill, any questions? You're good? Any questions from anyone in the audience? You guys are waiting on the next one. Okay. All right. Okay, thank you, Decca and Vanessa. I will be in touch with you later this week.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great
Thank you so much.
All right.
Help you enjoy the presentation. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. I think I'm done, right? Did that get me out? Okay. Let's see. So I will do a follow-up on this. The grant for the Park Service has a deliverable of either 2 new or 2 updated National Register nominations. I've already spoken to my contact at the Park Service. We are moving forward with updating the Old State Bank nomination because we found so much information that needs to go into that. So we have Cherry Keys, we have Carolyn Courtner Smith, we have Ms. Edmondson. So those are 3 stories that are all pretty important. They're all pretty big stories that need to go into that one. So we've already started working on that update. I've already started updating the paperwork. It is estimated to be in front of the Alabama Historical Commission for review in their spring 2025 meeting, because they meet twice a year, so it would be in the spring meeting. And the other one, we are looking at updating Old Town East, because Old Town East has First Missionary Baptist Church, which is one of the most salient buildings. They have been trying to get National Park Service money for a civil rights grant. One of the requirements is that that church essentially has civil rights checked off in the National Register nomination, which it currently isn't addressing it as fully as it needs to be. So I have been working with the State Preservation Office and talking to them about making sure that nomination is updated with the data needed to ensure that that church could potentially be competitive for grant funding as well.
Which church are you talking about?
First Missionary Baptist. And so we put in a request, $500,000 in funding from the Park Service. We will probably know, I think they let grant applications know around December if they will receive that money or not. They have significant water intrusion issues and brick issues on the exterior of that building, and it probably needs more than $500,000 worth of work, but that will at least get the process started along with a historic structures report. So we're hopeful that they will be competitive on that.
Is that a matching grant by anyone?
No, Park Service for those grants, they are not matching, and they have the ability to apply a second round if they are successful with meeting the requirements for the first round. So we're tentatively hopeful at this point that will get the process moving, and if not, then we will just work with them to apply again next year. We'll give it at least two shots. So that is the update on that one. Next up is one of our certified local government grants from the state. We use to survey Austinville, to be looking at Austinville and what it could be potentially. Jamie, I need to pull up your PowerPoint. And we have Jamie DeStefano from Impact 7G here this evening. And she will go, Jamie, I'm going to have you, I can get this up and running. Come on, let me get in. If you say, you can sit there and speak, and if you just say next, I'll click the slides for you.
My new glasses, because I can't see anything these days. So I'm Jamie DeStefano. I'm happy to be here. It's good to see you guys again. It's always good to return to Decatur. So I'm still in the process. I want to thank Caroline for her patience because we did have some delays and setbacks, and she is working diligently with me to make sure that we have the final products to you guys here in the next week or two. And that final product will be about 360 survey forms of buildings surveyed in Austinville, and then a final survey report with our recommendations and our survey findings. But what we're going to talk about today will be reflected in that report. So if we want to get started, next slide. So the boundaries of the survey area were predetermined by the city, and were drawn to more or less follow that historic town limits of Austinville before it was annexed into the city in 1956. We did exclude from the boundary a very large residential subdivision that was built, I believe, in the 1990s at the south end of the town. And you can kind of see that gap there that was excluded. There are about 500 parcels encompassing the district with 285 acres. None of the Austinville has been previously surveyed, so this is the first survey of the area, and there are no buildings or properties currently listed on the National Register. Next slide. So little is really known about the early history of the Austinville area. It initially began as a farming community when Samuel and Nancy Austin arrived in the early 1800s, establishing a family-run farm there. By the 1880 federal census, it does confirm several neighbors of the Austin families, including the Hockle, Evans, Lipscomb, Gregory, Adams, and Sykes families. And each of those families were recorded as being farmers, so it was definitely a farming community leading up towards the end of the 19th century. By that time, most of the descendants of the Austin family had actually relocated elsewhere in the country, but they did leave a significant reminder of their presence, being the namesake of the community, is a small family plot, which is in the heart of present-day Austinville, just across the street from the city park. So we can go to the next slide. As early as 1873, the community reportedly had a few houses, a grist mill, as well as a cotton mill, while nearby Decatur was flourishing with railroad and industrial concerns. But between 1890 and 1933, the L&N railroad shops here in Decatur really did play an important role in the development of Austinville. Many of those employed at the shops or in other industrial enterprises in Decatur did choose to reside outside of the city limits. Instead, they moved to Austinville, presumably attracted to more rural, affordable suburban environment. Many of those families had larger lots that were afforded there rather than in town residential neighborhoods of Decatur. So by the close of the century, it was a burgeoning community, was emerging with a school and churches solidifying that formation of a community. Okay. So the first school was initially held in a one-room log building by the 1890s. I believe it was demolished or destroyed by fire around 1903 and rebuilt the following year as a Baptist church, and the school held classes in that church building for some time until they erected their new school building. The establishment of the school and the church congregations do attest to that growing population within what was relatively still rural during that period. In 1896, the first official land subdivision in Austinville was laid out, and that was known as Woodlawn. And then the following year, the Railroad Association addition was laid out, and they boasted the sale of several affordable lots in the area. And because it was the Railroad Association, it's highly likely that the railroad built that area specifically to house its many employees that were working at the shops in nearby Decatur. In 1900, we have another third land subdivision in Austinville, which was the Edgewood Addition. That was along Lamar Street. And in 1907, there were advertisements in the newspaper that did speak towards the rapid growth of the community. And here's just a clipping of one of those announcements. That same year, in 1907, is when Austinville was officially incorporated as a town, and residential lots within the Roper and Birch additions were ready for sale. So between 1896 and 1907, there are several land additions and subdivisions being developed in the area, which really amplified growth and development. Austinville first appears as a town on the 1910 United States Census, and that census really confirms that it was a white demographic residing in the town. And by far, the vast majority of the heads of households were employed as laborers at the railroad shops. And when we spoke with some members of the community at a public meeting, they did, say that most of their family members did work at the railroad shops, and it was kind of very solidified by that census record. It was just railroad shop, which was very interesting. So ultimately, the neighborhood, Austinville, was established as a predominantly white working class community during the early 20th century. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So new construction in Austinville continued during the 1920s. It was at a much slower rate than the prior decades. City Hall was built that year on Clara Avenue behind what was later called Bussey's Drugstore. Unfortunately, the City Hall was recently demolished, and I had a photo in my report from Google Earth Street View, so I didn't actually get to photograph it for the survey, but there is a photo in the report that you'll receive. In 1937, on land donated by A.J. Roper, the Austinville High School was constructed. The school cost approximately $35,000, contained an auditorium, an office, a library, and 6 classrooms. It was a great source of pride among the community. Not only did it have an excellent educational program, but the school's athletics program was brought great excitement to the community with games and tournaments, very well attended. In addition to the new high school in the 1930s, Austinville also saw the construction of a small 2-cell jail. It was built by the WPA at a cost of $1,293, and it was located directly behind City Hall on Clara Street, and that is still extant. Then a Sanborn map from 1929, which was updated in 1938, I believe, is really a great source of information regarding the built environment of Austinville during that time. The map doesn't cover the entirety of the town. It only extends west to Spring Street, I believe, or Maple Street. All of the houses shown on the map do reflect modest one-story wood frame dwellings with both rectangular forms and multi-wing cottages, really reminiscent of a working class community. Okay. Following World War II, Austinville experienced a renewed period of growth and development. One of the big projects in Austinville occurred in 1953 when the former Austinville Elementary School was relocated to its present location just south of the high school. The former school was located within the present-day Austinville Park. It was erected in 1922. Also, it was a great pride for the community. It's a beautiful 2-story brick building that was later demolished. I'll go back to that later. But the Austinville residents for this school did vote themselves an extra tax to fund the school, also contributing their own money and labor towards the construction of its cafeteria. The cafeteria was a detached building, and it was located between the high school and the elementary school, and it was used by both of the school students. And here is just the upper photo it's a little blurry, but from the newspaper of the school after it was finished. And then the second bottom photo is inside the new cafeteria. Okay. So the 1950s also saw finally, since 1907, additional subdivisions and additions were developed in Austinville, particularly along Austinville Road, where the Sandland subdivisions were laid out between 1955 and 1957. The Lowry addition was laid out in 1959. And then we have a couple more additions in the 1960s. So here you can kind of see, and thank you, Caroline, for providing this map. It was great. The different land subdivisions over time. The bright one in green on the left is the 1897 Railroad Association addition, which is the largest. Okay. As early as 1953, discussions were underway concerning the potential annexation of Austinville into nearby Decatur. The first vote was voted against in 1954. However, in 1956, the community once again voted, and annexation was approved by a very slim margin of 8 votes. The city mayor immediately announced the plans to provide the same services in Austinville as those in all parts of the city of Decatur, including road improvements and maintenance, garbage collection, fire, police protection, among other services. Since the 70s, notable changes to the built environment include the kind of shifting of the traffic along Austinville Road, attaching with Bradley Street and connecting with Spring Avenue. It just resulted in a slight curve and shifting there. And then also the large-scale subdivision that was excluded from the survey boundary, but it did take out a chunk of historic Austinville residential houses and some minnow fishery pools. Okay. So the Austinville neighborhood generally retains its historic grid layout and arrangement of streets. Most of those streets, particularly those in the Railroad Association subdivision, have feature alleyways that separate through the blocks. There are a high number of vacant lots throughout the neighborhood and new construction as well that is distributed throughout the survey area. And these two elements, the vacant lots and the new construction, are all indicate losses of an earlier resource, potential loss of an earlier resource that was either left vacant site or redeveloped. The area toward the center of Austinville, particularly around Bradley, between Willow Avenue and Spring Avenue, is more varied in its makeup, whereas the rest of the neighborhood is largely residential. In this area, in addition to residents, it also includes all of the commercial buildings that survive, the old jail, churches, and the Austinville Cemetery and Park. Okay, next slide. Next slide, sorry. So here's just a chart showing the distribution of all of the resources that we did document. There was a total of 441 resources. 385 of those were constructed through 1976 and were surveyed for this project. So that's where the 385 survey forms you'll have here shortly come from. Only one of those resources predates the late 19th century establishment of the development of Austinville, and that is the Austin Cemetery, with its first interment in 1879. So construction dates you can see here show a gradual increase from the turn of the century through 1930s, though this number might not be entirely accurate because some of those resources have been demolished and replaced with new construction. But it's clearly demonstrated that the beginning in the 40s through the 1960s was a much accelerated increase in new construction in the neighborhood before quickly dropping in the 1970s. Okay. Austinville today is recognized as a residential suburb of Decatur, though it does contain a variety of resources that one might expect to occur in small towns. So of the resources, 368 of the 385 are domestic. There's only 6 surviving commercial buildings and 6 religious buildings. In addition, there's the historic cemetery, the former jail, city park, and Austinville Elementary School. Okay. So here you can see the distribution or breakdown of resources by their residential type or form. Of the 368 historic domestic buildings, only 4 of those are duplexes. The rest are single-family residential. Most are wood frame construction, many with brick veneer exteriors, and that's usually particularly seen on the ranch houses. And all but one residence is 1 story. The majority of the resources do reflect a prescribed residential type or form. And as you can see here, the ranch house predominates in the neighborhood, really corresponding with that big, large boom period following World War II. And then bungalows follow in a number of occurrences. Distinct house forms from the late 19th century and early 20th century in Austinville include 3 folk forms known as saddlebags, single pile dwellings, and gable wing cottages. All are attributed to the town's early establishment as a working class neighborhood. And so there's quite a few of those. Most have lost some integrity, a minimum of some integrity. But they're great examples of working class housing in the neighborhood. Okay. So next we have the bungalow, which was popular nationwide from 1910 to around 1950. And the minimal traditional house is most associated with the efficient and cost-effective housing following the Great Depression through World War II. So we've got examples of those. Next slide. And then the ranch house, everybody knows that. It's by far the most popular house type in the United States. It has a long, low profile with an emphasis on horizontal lines. And one of the most distinguishing characteristics or features of the ranch house is an inclusion of the integral garage or carport that's either recessed beneath the main roof or attached to the building. The frequency of the garage attests to the rise in both automobile ownership as well as a middle-class population. And this chart on the bottom, gosh, I can't see this map, shows the distribution in red of all of the ranch houses. So they're not really designated to a distinct area. Well, there are some groupings, but they really occur throughout the entire historic district. Okay. So as a working class neighborhood, it's not surprising that nearly 92% of the residences in Austinville lack exterior ornamentation. The few that do include representations of folk Victorian, colonial revival, and the craftsman style. Okay. Of the 6 surviving commercial buildings, the 2 earliest include the former Craig's Grocery and Bussey's Drugstore, and both are examples of the one-part commercial block building type and feature restrained elements of the early 20th century commercial style, particularly seen in the upper facades. Unfortunately, both of those storefronts have been heavily altered, but their upper facades are intact. Okay, next slide. So the earliest surviving church in Austinville is the former Church of Christ, which was erected in 1932. Also, unfortunately, substantial additions and remodeling the church largely overshadow its original design. So the Austinville Baptist Church and the Austinville United Methodist Church, both built in the 1940s, are good examples of extant churches in Austinville. The Baptist Church is a good example of a front gabled church with colonial revival design, and the Methodist Church features a prominent temple front design with a more high stylized colonial revival application. Okay. And then just some other notable resources that are definitely worth mentioning, particularly for their historical significance, is the Austinville High School. The current complex began in 1937. The majority of that facility, unfortunately, was raised to make way for more updated facilities. I commend the designers, though, for maintaining this historic core. So that portion there is the original historic core of the 1937 school building, but the rest of the building is non-historic. And then on the south side of that, we have the International Style Elementary School. The two are now connected and are the Austinville Elementary School. And then, of course, the Old City Jail, the small 2-cell brick building, is really reminiscent of a historic calaboose for less dangerous offenders. Though abandoned, it's the only building attributed to a governing body of what was the independently incorporated town of Austinville that survives today. Okay. So I'll quickly run through our findings with integrity. So the National Register recognizes integrity with its qualities of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association that is required to qualify for the National Register. So during the course of the survey, each property was assigned a rating of low, moderate, or good integrity. And that just helps us kind of determine whether there is a potential historic district. The majority of the resources within Austinville do exhibit some degree of alteration, from relatively modest changes to more substantial remodels. And working with Caroline and SHPO in determining kind of those ratings of integrity, if there was just, whether it be vinyl siding or just windows, those we might weigh a little bit more generously to a moderate degree. But if there's a combination of alterations of both, foundation changes, roof changes, then we would probably rate it at a low integrity. And there were a few things that we did come across with regards to metal roofing. If there is metal roofing on a ranch house, it was typically would typically receive a low rating just because it has such a profile view from the street and really draws attention away from the original design of that building. And another instance that would receive a low integrity rating is enclosures of garages on ranch houses, because that is such a really important design feature of the ranch. So when the house's owners enclose that garage to accommodate interior space, especially if it's a front-facing garage. It really detracts from that original design of the house. So we did assign a low integrity rating for those. So in total, we have 184 resources that we did identify with a low integrity rating. Of those, 59 are recognized as 50 years of age or older. So in total, 184 resources would be recognized as non-contributing to a district. And you can see here the distribution of recommended contributing buildings in yellow and the recommended non-contributing in blue. So you can see it's very widespread. There's really no areas or groupings of buildings that are non-contributing that we could recommend for exclusion from a district boundary, which really has us on the fence of eligibility of a potential district or portion thereof. If you want to go to the next slide. So ultimately, we Impact 7G came to the conclusion that we don't see a feasible eligible National Register historic district, but we do see areas of recommendations for future preservation, educational opportunities, things like that. We do recommend further study for the old jail. It appears intact. I believe that new roof occurred in the 1970s. It was originally a flat roof, but it is incredibly significant to Austinville because it is, the only surviving building that has association to a governing body when it was its incorporated town. And it is frankly just very unique. So I'd be interested to see the interior observations and then further study comparing it with other similar, if there are any similar surviving jails like that in the county. So it could potentially be eligible for the National Register pending additional research. In terms of future preservation initiatives, definitely there is a lot of alterations and infill going on in Austinville, so some sort of guidance on how to kind of steer appropriate infill design or educating the public on proper restoration, perhaps hosting workshops to provide hands-on technical guidance is always a great idea. The burial markers in Austinville Cemetery, most of them are falling down. It might be a good idea to have the community come together and do some sort of restoration or conservation of the cemetery. It also might warrant a historic marker, recognizing the early settlement of the community as a farming community and the Austin family that is the namesake of Austinville. And then finally, a historic marker is definitely recommended in the city park to note the location of the original two schoolhouses that are no longer extant. And those were really integral to the community and were important, and it might be a good idea to consider a historical marker there or some sort of interpretive signage to educate the neighborhood and visitors to Austinville. That's it.
Thank you,
I hope that wasn't too long. I tried to condense.
It was good. Any questions from the board?
Can you go back to the Bussey's drugstore picture?
Any questions from the board?
So we're not going to apply for National Register for this area?
I can talk to the National Register Coordinator for the state, but it looks like there is not sufficient integrity within that neighborhood to qualify for
Well, I don't
listing.
want to be negative, but I just don't see the historical significance of this area.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are some great resources in the neighborhood, and it really does, there are portions of where you're driving around and do get that, feel of the historic working class community. But, there are most, if not all of the resources have some sort of a loss of integrity. And in many instances, it's just complete remodels, unfortunately. So with the percentage of what we recommend, and Caroline's still reviewing our form, so she might come back and disagree completely with some of our recommendations in terms of rating integrity. But right now, kind of from our perspective, I just think there's just too much loss of integrity to justify a district. But certainly an interesting history, and historic markers, interpretive signs are warranted, I think.
I used to work at the drugstore for Mr. Burt, and that block building to the right, Mr. Bussey used to loan money out of that during the Depression.
Oh, that's great. So do you have your name and number on the contact information?
Well, my name and email address.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll reach out to you.
Bradley Street is named after Mr. Bradley, which was one of the mayors of Austin.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's still such a strong sense of community amongst people who grew up there, you know.
Yeah.
But I think it's not matched by the actual historic
Right.
integrity
Yeah, which is-
of the resource.
Caroline, at the start of the project, directed me to a Facebook page, and that is an incredibly active
Yeah.
Facebook page of residents. So
Yeah.
that's where I got a bunch of my photos, which is great.
I need to get your email address too. I've got a couple of books at home about Austinville.
I have one that we got.
And I think it also might be something to explore if it's at the point where the history is very intriguing, but the physical manifestation of that is now gone, but the history is still there. It might be, I explore with a future grant getting a podcast so that we can get some oral interviews, we can get some people on tape. We definitely could explore getting markers and where they might go. And sometimes if buildings are important, but they're privately owned, and so a marker might not be feasible, I'm looking into some other alternatives as well for things that we might be able to produce. So,
Another thing too, Austin High School was named after the Austin family. There was an article in the Decatur Daily years ago about how Austin High School got its name. It was from the Austin family in Austin.
Well, the new Austin is big. Yeah, okay.
Which is nowhere near.
Yeah. Right.
well, thank you, Jamie.
Yes,
We
any
appreciate your
other
time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Thank
Very good.
you. Hope to see
Okay.
you guys again.
I will circle back with you, and we'll talk about some other resources as well. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Update, I don't have a slide for it, but Section 106 projects, those are the ones where we have typically, thus far, it's cell phone carriers putting in towers that they have to do an environmental review. We've had a lot of activity coming my way on 6th Avenue and in the Albany district. Most of them are in just outside the district in the commercial block, so sort of like behind Jack's, behind the gas stations in that area, near Pew Wright. And I think we have one that's going right on the corner of Grant and Somerville. But so far, that has been it. It's too soon for the bridge study to trigger anything that's way out on the horizon. And nothing has happened with that parcel off of the Beltline that they were looking. We even did a balloon test over a year ago, a year and a half ago now. But that project has been silent for a while. So either they have found another site or they have focused on something else for the short term. Update on Magnolia Sykes. The reports were finished at this point. We're still waiting for GIS to see if they can finalize getting Magnolia Sykes in a way that the public can use those data points online. That's a very tedious process because what we're hoping to is to literally get to the point that if you're at home, you can pull this image up and you can click a dot and it will tell you who is interned at that spot if there's a marker. And that there will also be a little box to the side where you could put a family member's name in, and then the dot to show where they're buried will flash if we have that data. And we have photos to go with all of them. It's such a massive file system because we have photos for about, I think, 600 and some graves. That's just a really big system for them to sort of try to piece in. So they are slowly working on that. And council has been aware of both the reports on these and the findings. So I don't have any updates from them beyond that.
Well, I did meet with the city council, went and talked with them last night,
Okay.
and asked that the obtaining of the 2 cemeteries be put on the agenda so legal can give us an update
Okay.
on where they're at. So I don't know when they'll put that on the agenda. The McMaster said, well, let's get in touch with Carolyn, but essentially what I was asking for was a legal give an update on where they're at on obtaining those. So if you see that coming up on the agenda,
Okay.
and I'll send a note to Kyle Pike that he lets us know we can get our people there for the meeting when they go through and talk about that.
Okay. Old State Bank, I have received a set of the initial documents on what is essentially referred to as selective demolition. They're things that need to be pulled out for the engineers to do their final intensive report. So they're asking for like some of the HVAC units to be pulled out. And the HVAC's not working currently. It has to come out anyway because that will allow more advanced scanning. They want some plaster removal on the walls so they can look at the framing because they need this data now to create construction documents for the rehabilitation. So I'm waiting to get a last set of bids on that. I'm hoping that will be done by the end of September, which means the engineering firm can be back in October to do their final run so they can start working on construction and bid documents for the project. I have also applied to the National Park Service for what is called a HERS grant. It's History of Equal Rights. Specifically for Old State Bank, the maximum award given is $750,000. I have applied for that. With a letter of support from the state saying that this building is very important with Lila Edmondson, Carolyn Kortner-Smith, and Cherry Keys. So it's associated with women working each in their own area with that struggle for equal rights. They only give about 10 to 15 of these in the entire U.S., so they're quite competitive, but I've put one in, so we will see. The Delano Park Master Plan and HSR is moving along. Some of you may have attended the open house they had this last week where they had taken all of their findings in the first open house and then they gave people like, okay, you told us you wanted X, Y, Z. These are some ideas that go with each one of these. Which direction would you like us to pursue? And so they just finished that last Friday, so I have not even had a follow-up meeting with them since that, but I was really impressed with the boards, the time they had spent on the information and really understanding the park and understanding what are the components of the park when they went in, what is working, what needs updating. Tourism has a brochure. I'm working with them. That's not what this picture is. I don't have a slide for that. To update tours of both Old Decatur and Albany. So we're hoping that will be finished off in the next couple of months. We have a contract with Macomb Group to update existing brochures. Last month, well, very end of July, beginning of August, the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions had their every other year meeting. Some of you may recall occasionally I will send you training information from them, or I will tell you, here is a newsletter from them. That is the national organization that works with preservation commissions. They had their meeting in West Palm Beach because nothing says summer like summer in Florida during hurricane season. It was quite warm. I was down there for the meeting. I ran a session while I was there. So we did a day trip into Miami. It was really interesting to see some of their preservation, whether it's their Art Deco theater. This is a photograph of one of their African American cemeteries that we visited and some of the preservation challenges that they are having. If you'll notice, the graves there are very unusual. They're mostly vaults, just slightly embedded into the ground. And I had asked if that was due to water table. It's not. It's because the majority of the African Americans in that particular community came out of the Bahamas. The traditional burying technique in the Bahamas, which apparently are quite rocky, is you have to put your vault on top. You just cannot dig deep enough because of the rocks. And so when they immigrated to Miami, they brought that tradition with them. So it is not required by the landscape, it is a cultural tradition. But it does make maintaining the cemetery quite challenging. So it was a very interesting conversation. Also got to visit the Hampton House. If you are familiar with the movie One Night in Miami with the meetings of like Martin Luther King Jr., this is the hotel that the African American community stayed at during a segregated Miami. So every major African American politician, entertainer, sports figure would have stayed at this hotel. It has been restored. It was quite a spectacular place to visit. We even got to see the rooms that MLK Jr. stayed in when he was there. And this was one of the conference sites that we were able to visit. So it was really interesting. They have their share of losses too. I was there while they were taking down. This is a place where a neighborhood does not have local design review, and the small houses are being replaced by duplexes that are worth $1 million or more, and the neighborhood is really struggling with those losses because at this point it would be difficult to landmark them. It's one of those things where it's kind of the horse is out of the barn and everybody wants their increased property value with the demolition. And that is me, so you think I was not at the beach the entire time. You will see, here is actually a slide that shows Old State Bank. I'm giving the presentation on our underrepresented community grant. So I led a panel that had a grant reviewer, an organizer from the National Park Service, the historic preservation officer from the state of Wisconsin was on my panel, as well as there was a small community in Vermont that won an underrepresented community award for their work with Native American sacred sites. So we were talking about different ways the grant works, small, big, medium, whether it's state level, whether it's a small village, whether it's City of Decatur. And it was actually we had a late session. It was like 4 o'clock on a Saturday, and we had about 30 people there. So we were very surprised with the number of people that turned out. Lastly, Phil, you had asked for me to do a little bit of research on the mural that used to hang in the annex, that building that was attached to Old State Bank that is no longer extant. They had a professional conservator look at it in 2013 out of Atlanta. There's 6 panels. They're 7 feet tall. They're about 12 feet long, so when they're strung together, it's 70 feet long, so that is the space that it was designed to fill. In 2013, the estimates were to stabilize them and to mount them was $45,000, to stretch and clean was $75,000, and to restore them was between $75,000 and $270,000. And so those numbers are a decade old at this point. We do not have good photographs of them all laid out. The records from the conservator stated that they literally did not have a space big enough to do that, and they did not have camera equipment sufficient. So if the city wanted that done, they would have to find someone else, and this was a professional appraiser, but they were essentially like, you would have to find somewhere else to do this because we don't have a space large enough to hang them, to photograph them, to do what would be the first step in sort of moving forward at that point.
Okay.
So right now they are just archivally stored, which was the recommendation at the time.
I've got a PowerPoint presentation that has pictures of each of the panels I can send to you.
That would be great, thank you.
So where are they now, leaning up against?
They are Morgan County Archives. Safe.
Oh, you're
Yeah.
back.
They tricked me.
Led you astray.
Yeah. Oh, while we're redoing these bathrooms, you can just keep these for us, and so there they still are. But that's okay. There's not really another place for them. I don't know, unless someone wants to rent something.
So they're safe there.
They're
They are
safe. They're safe.
Yes, they are safely kept for now. So
I'll
any,
send that to you, then you can circulate it to the people
that
if you need to.
would be great. I was hoping to have an update on the CLG grants that we applied for this year. They still have not notified us. I talked to my counterpart there actually today. She said the federal government has finally given them money, so now they can give us money. So by December, I will definitely have an update because I'm expecting by the middle of October to know. We had requested money to update 2nd Avenue Albany. We resurveyed that district. It needs a boundary expansion and a boundary reduction. We had requested money for that. And we had also looked at a condition statement for the Carnegie if we could get a second grant. And we just never know how many grants they will give. It just depends on, they try to give every community one, and if they have additional money when they're finished, then they will go back. It's sort of like getting seconds at the buffet if we are allowed back in if they have already distributed to the full listing. Any questions?
So did I miss what we're doing with underrepresented communities part 2?
I just applied for more funding from the Park Service, but I will not know until December if we receive a second grant. It is
Okay.
difficult to get a second grant because they only give about 10 to 12 total, but I did request one specifically to do more in-depth research on Cedar Lake and Carver School and Sykes Cemetery,
Sykes
and to have a nomination come out of Cedar Lake. St. Peter Church is very interested in being on the register, and potentially Sykes Cemetery as well. Because they do require, as part of that, if you are receiving funds from that grant, you absolutely have to either produce a National Register nomination or update an existing one. Those are the requirements for the grant. So,
Where the old Cedar Lake School was, they're putting in a new park or something. That property is owned by the Decatur City Board of
yeah,
Education.
they're putting in a park there.
Who's funding that, do you know?
I would
Or-
assume they are, since they own it. If they're not doing it,
Right.
then it would be Park and Rec. Those would be the two options.
Okay. I just noticed that when I was driving by the other day.
Yeah.
Where is that? That old school in Cedar Lake?
It's was originally called the Cedar Lake Road, but it's on Lennox. I think when you turn off, when you go by the St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church, and then you take a right onto Ray Street and go all the way to the end of Ray Street, and then you take a right, and it's the field right there on your left, where they're putting up basketball courts, and there's a pavilion they're putting up there. So
I have to notice that.
that would be, I think, an ideal place for a historical marker for the
That
Cedar
would
Lake
be a
School.
good, yeah.
But a lot of times you have these historical markers where you can't pull off the road to actually
You
stop
can actually
and
have
read
one
them.
in
and see
the
them.
park where people have stopped.
Yeah, and
That's a nice
stop,
place.
and that would be ideal.
I agree.
And if you do any research on Cedar Lake, one thing I'm trying to find is where the ball field was. She talked about Jake Johnson, that was one of the original settlers of Cedar Lake. His son, Otis Johnson, had Cedar Lake, well, went by the White Sox, the Negro team, the Red Sox and Blue Sox, so it went by 3 different names. But I'm trying to figure out where the ball field was, and I don't know if it was around, they said it was on the Beeline Highway. So I'm thinking it might have been maybe where Central Baptist Church is located at now. But if you run across something like that, I'd be interested to know where the ball field is located.
All right. Any other questions?
We did find, this Michael Coulter from Dalton, Georgia, has been working on Gar Cemetery. And he's asked, I think he's got in touch with some of the city council meeting to remove a tree that's on the southwest corner that could, it's dead, and it could damage the wall if it falls. But one of the things he did when he was there was he actually uncovered the gravesite of Charlotte. So we now know exactly that as he was digging and doing some cleaning up, and actually the outline of the bricks that was Charlotte's grave was located. And we think 2 of the pieces of stone that are still there, if we could turn them over, would be the inscription for Charlotte's grave. That, which was one of the ones we've been hunting for a while, probably one of the most significant parts of that gravesite. So, a little news on the Gar Cemetery.
Okay. Well, do we have anything else? Or?
All right, so I need a motion to adjourn in a second.
I'll make a motion.
Those in favor say
All
aye.
right, all in favor?
All right.
All right, I think you guys can go home, and I will see you in December.